So, Jean-Paul Sartre, that's what I want to talk about today, who I want to talk about today, who he was, what did he do, and what am I doing. So he was a 20th century philosopher, not just philosopher, but that's the way I'll be approaching his life. And he wrote a crazy book called Being in Nothingness, 800 pages of very, very dense material, but very important. I think the ideas in there are not just original, but really important for understanding human life, what it means to be a human. And what I'm trying to do is, with this video series, is step through being in nothingness, go from the beginning right to the end, and just break it down chapter by chapter, and give a kind of a detailed analysis of, well, not so much an analysis, but a detailed summary of what Sartre is trying to say. Because it's dense, it's really hard work. It's not always easy to grasp what some of the points that Sartre is making. And hopefully this video series will help fill in any gaps that might crop up during a reading. So the idea of it is that while you're reading the book, you kind of work through the book in tandem with these video with the videos, so that you can hopefully fill in any gaps that you might have, or get a more complete understanding. Or if you've spotted something that I haven't mentioned, or you disagree with something, throw it up in the comment section, and let's open it up to discussion. Anybody else can chime in, and hopefully we'll all come away from this with a better understanding of the material. Win-win, I guess. So the best way, I think, or the way I've kind of expected or planned it, is that you use this as a kind of a supplementary thing to your reading. You can, I think it's possible to get something from the videos without doing the reading itself. I think that you'll be able to follow along anyway, even if you don't do the reading. But like I say, I think the reading is, it's not, these videos aren't intended as a substitute for the book, let me say that. So, but having said that, it's up to you how you use them, I guess. So that's what I'm trying to do. And another thing I want to mention quickly before we get started is my website, absurdbeing.com. You can go and have a look at that if you like. There's some possibly interesting stuff there. There's a philosophy page, there's a Buddhism page, atheism page, there's a page of articles I've written and stuff. Some of that may be interesting to you. If it is, take a look. But for the purposes of this video series, there's also a Sartre page which you can access. And if you go to the Sartre page, there's a whole bunch of information about him and his philosophy, but also there's a downloadable Word file called Being in Nothingness, and that is what I'll be using, the source material I'll be using for the videos. So if you want to download those, you can read through, and it's really just a more detailed outline than more detailed summary, I guess, of what I'm presenting on these videos. One more thing then as well. I'm not an academia. I'm not a professor, so my ideas are really my own. I haven't submitted these in journals or in articles for other professors to kind of peer review or anything like that. So these are just my own interpretations of Sartre and the way I think, or what I think he's trying to get across. Feel free to disagree, feel free to throw in your own comments. That's what it's all about. And having said that, I think we might make a quick start. So background, Sartre, who is he? Just a short bio, just to give an outline of his life. He was born in 1905 in Paris. He studied philosophy at university. Key influences in Sartre's thought include people like Edmund Husserl, who's most commonly associated with Phenomenology, Martin Heidegger, who is existentialist, but other thinkers including Hegel. Kierkegaard's ideas crop up a lot in Sartre's writing, and also Henry Bergson was another important influence. Sartre credits him with having drawn him to philosophy in the first place. So after graduating, he wrote Nausea, a novel of his, in 1938, and he joined the French resistance he joined the war, I should say, in 1939 against the Germans. He was captured in 1940 and spent 9 months as a POW. After being released, he joined the French resistance and was very active in opposing the Germans. And after the war, actually, he became quite politically active, aligning himself with Marxism. Then he went on to write, he wrote Being and Nothingness, I should say, in 1943. And that's his number one philosophical text. He wrote another book as well called The Critique of Dialectical Reason. He wrote that in 1960. But Being and Nothingness is really where his key ideas were formulated and set out. He was offered the Nobel Prize in Literature in around 1964, I think, which he declined. He declined it because he said he didn't want to become affiliated or associated with any institution. He really valued his independence, and he thought that accepting a prize like that would mean that he kind of compromises his values in some way. So he rejected the Nobel Prize. And another way he defined himself in opposition to norms and values of his time was in his romantic relationship with Simone de Beauvoir, whom he met at university. And they had a lifelong involvement, but unconventional. It was an open relationship for a start, and they never got married. Marriage being another one of those institutions that Sartre really felt the need to not to buy into, to kind of stand against as an authentic individual. And that really, I think, encapsulates a lot of what he stood for, defining oneself as an authentic individual, acting in a way that you're not compromised or following the crowd in any way, not just conforming to values and ideals that don't have their origin in you. In the last 10 years of his life, Sartre became quite ill. He was almost blind by 1973, and he died in 1980. Interesting little fact, 50,000 people attended Sartre's funeral when he died. So that really just stands as a testament to how popular and how well known he was. He wasn't just a philosopher. He was as I mentioned, he was a novelist. He was also a playwright, very politically active. He was, in general, Jean-Paul Sartre was an intellectual and a well-known thinker of his time. So that's a little bit about Sartre as the man. I also want to quickly talk about his philosophy a little bit before we look at Being and Nothingness itself. And I think the way that Sartre often gets approached is through a shorter book called Existentialism is a Humanism. And this was actually a talk that Sartre gave to the public, general public, in 1945. and it's very easy to read. Very easy to read. It's very clearly, his ideas are clearly stated, and it's a nice, neat summary of Sartre's thought. The downside with it is that it's not really a neat summary. And what I mean by that is it's just a real superficial glance at Sartre's thought. So first of all, it's not extensive. He doesn't discuss concepts like nothingness, being for itself, being. He doesn't go into any detail at all. And second, there are no reasons given. There's no justification behind why he thinks, for example, we're free. It's just there. You can read through existentialism as a humanism, and come away with some ideas of what Sartre held, but you won't really have any understanding as to why he held those ideas. And so it just becomes kind of, I know Sartre said we're free, but, well, science says we're determined, so, that's the end of that. Being in nothingness really lets you drill down a little bit deeper. And that's one reason why I really want to focus on the main text rather than these kind of side texts. And another thing is that you can read summaries about Sartre written by very competent philosophers now, and they're excellent, and they cover all of these points. But even so, reading Being and Nothingness it is invaluable when it comes to understanding Sartre in any kind of comprehensive fashion. Summaries are good, and there are some good summaries out there, but they're no substitute for reading the original text, I've discovered. So I'd recommend really engaging with it. Having said that, having criticised that kind of approach, I'm briefly going to do it now and just give you a brief overview of Sartre. So maybe first of all, what is existentialism? That's probably the first thing we should look at. Existentialism is really just a way of understanding human condition, understanding what it means to exist for human beings. What does that mean for us? Really, that's it. It tends to be associated with a lot of negative, kind of pessimistic thoughts and emotions. Like things like anguish, dread, duty, responsibility. These kind of words get thrown about. Abandonment, and one criticism of existentialism is that it is negative. It only looks at the negative and not the positive. There are many good things about existence, which existentialism, by and large, doesn't really deal with. But I think the answer to that is that existentialism goes one step lower than those things. So it's not just talking about being sad or being unhappy or being scared. It goes one step lower and looks at what exists, what conditions were there in place before you could even be happy or unhappy or scared or any of these other emotions. What was in place first? It's looking for bedrock. It's looking for the existence before any of these things that you build on top of it. And so it's quite harsh in that it typically doesn't sugarcoat things and say, oh, you know what, there was a loving God and he created you and everything's wonderful and your life has purpose because God gave you purpose and so on. It's not usually like that. We're usually dealing with things like you didn't ask to be born and yet you are, here you are. There's a sense of abandonment that comes with that. And whether you think that there's a God or not, there is that sense of abandonment. Here we are, we're living this life we didn't ask to live. It may be good, it may be bad. We can, depending on how we approach it or the experiences that we have, it may be a positive experience overall. But still, there is that abandonment that kicked it all off. And that it's that level that that existentialism is driving at. And so that's why a lot of the concepts tend to be perceived as negative or pessimistic. So anyway, that's existentialism very briefly. So Sartre was very much an existentialist. One key term that always crops up when you're talking about Sartre: existence precedes essence. And very briefly, what that means is we exist before we have any kind of purpose or meaning. So if you think about a knife, the concept, the idea of the knife, the purpose of the knife exists first in the mind of the knife maker. And then he goes about satisfying that purpose with a utensil, an implement, the knife. So the idea of the knife, the purpose of the knife exists before the knife itself does. Human beings, however, are not quite like that. We exist first, and then we find ourselves grappling with this problem. What does that mean? What's the meaning of that? What's my purpose? So in that sense, for Sartre, we exist first, and that precedes our essence, what that existence might mean for us. It's also, his philosophy was atheistic, so he doesn't resort to a creator God to whom we can ask these kind of questions and get coherent answers. And so his philosophy is atheistic. In Existentialism as a humanism, he does actually say it's not atheistic in the sense that he's opposed to God. He's not trying to prove that God doesn't exist. It's atheistic in the sense that it doesn't matter whether God exists or not. Everything that he's talking about still holds true, even if there is a creator God. And and that's the way he wants to tell us his philosophy is atheistic. We still have to stand on our own, even if there is a God who created us. Another notion that's key in Sartre is this idea of radical freedom. So freedom, we have freedom in that we can choose what we do, we can choose our responses to certain situations in life. That's reasonably easy enough to understand. The radical idea, that comes from this Sartre's point that we don't have the option to choose whether or not to choose. We're free, and we can't choose not to be free. We're condemned to be free, another Sartrean phrase. And in that sense, it's radical. It's not just freedom to do what you want or not, but you have no choice in that matter. You must make a decision. And even if you choose not to make a decision, that is a decision that you've made in freedom. In that sense, we're radically free. Another classical concept in Sartre is bad faith. And this tends to be misrepresented, I think, and misinterpreted quite a lot. It's generally treated as being something that is opposed to authenticity. So, authentic, you're being true to yourself. Bad faith, you're not being true to yourself. And I think that's a misreading of Sartre. I won't go into why I think that just here. We'll look at that in the third or fourth video, I think. It's a little bit, we need to cover a little bit more background before we look at that in more detail. I'll just leave it here by saying I think it's nothing to do with authenticity, bad faith. We'll look at it later. Another concept is nothingness, this idea of negation. Sartre will have a lot to say about that, and it's in the title, right? Being in nothingness. Just to give you a taste of what that will be about, this idea of negation, it really precedes anything any kind of knowledge or understanding that we might come to formulate over in our investigations of the world. Because if you think about something, say the computer in front of me, in order for me to apprehend that computer or perceive that computer, I must first be aware of something else. Be aware that that computer is not me. Without that fundamental negation, then there's no way for me to even perceive that there's a computer there. So before any kind of understanding, before we look at any attributes or qualities of an object, there's a negation underlying that. And that's what Sartre is very much interested in. Two more things to finish up: being for itself and being in itself. Both very important terms in Sartre. And at the risk of oversimplifying at this stage, being for itself is essentially consciousness, and being in itself is essentially everything else. Although those are existential terms, so it's more like the being of consciousness as being for itself, and the being of everything else as being in itself. Again, we'll look at those in more detail. That's pretty much almost all I wanted to cover today. Two more things I just want to briefly run through. The first is ontology, and the second thing is phenomenology. Both of these are indispensable when it comes to Sartre, and we have to know something about them. Ontology is very simple. It's just the science or the study of being, study of existence. Usually it's stands in opposition to ontic. Ontic being a specific or particular instance of being. Being is more like the general framework within which these individual instances appear. So ontology, study of being, and phenomenology, a little bit more subtle, but briefly, phenomenology is less of a what and more of a how. It's a method of inquiry into the world around us, and or the way we understand the world, and the way we interact with the world. So in general, I think phenomenology really seeks to bring back subjective experience into our descriptions of the world. Now, the history of Western thought has tended to remove subjective experience from the picture in order to free ourselves from any bias or tainted opinions which distort our understandings of truth or reality, whatever that is. So in order to get to that, what's real, we think we have to abstract from this subjective experiencer, which is us. And so we've got this dichotomy, subjective, objective, where subjective has acquired kind of a negative connotation. Subjective meaning it's just in your mind, or it's just your interpretation. There are other valid interpretations. What we want to know is really what's real, what's true. That's what the objective is. So there's that kind of dichotomy there. And it's true that I think it's valuable in some cases that abstracting from an experiencer, the first person experience, to get at something objective. And that's what science is based on. And if I think about an example, perhaps the table here is, science tells me that this table is made up of atoms which are 99% empty space. And that's what science says. It's real, it's true, that's what this table is. But that's not how I experience it. And that's not how any human being who's ever lived has ever experienced this table. It's always solid. It's solid to me, it's solid to you, and to everyone else. And we can't interact with it. We can't understand this table without that correlative understanding that it's solid. That's our phenomenological perspective. That's the way we know and understand this table. And it's not so much about saying that one's right and one's wrong. It's not about pitting science against phenomenology or vice versa. The point is that phenomenology is describing and understanding the lived world, the world that we live in, the world that we experience, as opposed to this idealized, objectified, highly objectified world of science. So in short, it's really bringing back subjective experience, because that's how we experience the world. That's how we live in the world, is through our subjective experience. And it's no good just discounting that, because we're human beings. We are human, and that's the way we live. That's the way we experience and interact and engage with things in the world. And that has value and meaning to us as human beings. So there's one particular difference, I think, that's worth mentioning when it comes to phenomenology, and that is regarding the object. So in, say, a Cartesian view or scientific view, you've got the subject on one hand and the object on the other. And the subject is a mental subject, and it creates internal representations of this external object. And that's fine, but the problem is, of course, that it separates those two realms, and there's no way, once we've separated those two, there's no way to bridge that gap. And that is a problem. It's great for science. It lets us invent many different things and discover many different things and understand the world in a different way. But we're also human beings. And this is where the phenomenological approach comes in, because we can't understand the world as like a robot, and we wouldn't want to. When I look at something, I don't look at it with an electron microscope, which tells me what it's really made up of, but I look at it with a human eye, which tells me that it's red, even though atoms have no color. And it's not that that's wrong, it's just that that's the way we experience the world. And there's no way of, we wouldn't want to change that. We wouldn't want to see the world through an electron microscope. When I hear music, I don't hear it like an antenna. I don't receive the sound waves like an antenna does. I don't pick them up that way. So I hear words and harmonies, melodies, these kind of things, whereas an antenna just picks up sound waves, vibrating molecules in the air. It's not about one being true and one being false. It's about one being useful in a certain situation, in a certain context. But if we're talking about a human being, human understanding, human listening or perception, then we need to use something like phenomenology, and that's more appropriate. So we've got this idea. So back to I lost my train of thought. Subject object, Descartes, and the two are separated. That's not the way phenomenology looks at it. Phenomenology approaches this not as an object, but we call it an existent or a phenomenon. Both words that I'll be using a lot. And there are two important things, I think, to bear in mind when we're thinking about objects in a phenomenological sense, from a phenomenological perspective, is they're not just physical. We're not just talking about external things. Anything you focus on, anything you think about, is a phenomenon. So we can have phenomena of abstract ideas, concepts, love, happiness, as well as physical things that I see around me. Anything I direct my attention to can become a phenomenon, and therefore becomes understandable in phenomenological terms. And the other thing that's important about a phenomenon is that it reveals itself to us through a number of, or series of, what Edmund Husserl called Abschattung, which is German for adumbrations or appearances. Another word that I'll use as well as aspects. So perhaps the best way to look at this is to take an example. So you've got a phone. If I can look at the front of the phone, and I see algae and there's a button down here, that's one appearance, one aspect. I can look at this phone from the back and get a different appearance. There's a camera, some more writing, 4G, LTE, whatever. That's a different appearance, a second appearance. I can look at this phone from any number of different angles. I can experience it in any number of different ways through different through different senses. I can touch the phone. I can listen, hear something, engage with it that way. Each one of those different ways of engaging, perceiving this phone, is a different adumbration, Abschattung. And these, the sum total of these, describe this existent. So you might say that seems obvious. Okay, what's so special about that? Well, it gets rid of this idea that there's a fixed object here of certain dimensions and composed of a certain material, and that is what this object is. It eliminates that, and instead we apprehend the object more as part of our lived reality, lived experience, not as this abstract, dead, inanimate kind of thing that's divorced from us. It becomes, what this thing is the series of appearances or aspects, adumbrations that we have of it. And it's interesting also to note that those appearances are infinite in number, so we can't ever completely apprehend the object, because there are always other appearances that we can experience when it comes to any object. Which makes sense if you think about it, because if we're looking at something from a human lived perspective, it's not reducible to just being this fixed solid thing. We can always experience it in a slightly different way, and none of those different appearances or Abschattung are unique or privileged or more right than any other. And I think that's an important thing. So whether I look at the phone from far away or from up close, if I look at it from far away, it looks very small. If I look at it from up close, it looks very big. If my hand is hot and the phone is cold, it feels very cold. If my hand is cold and the phone is hot, it feels if my hand is hot and the phone is cold, it feels very cold. If my hand is cold, the phone will feel warmer. So, but we're not saying that one of these is more true or more correct than any other appearance. Each appearance reveals the phone to me in a slightly different way, and no appearance is more valid or more correct than any other, because we're looking at the phone in a wider, more experiential setting through phenomenology than if we were to tackle it through this Cartesian kind of scientific approach, which completely removes the first person experience from the picture. So that's phenomenology. Hopefully that's somewhat clear. We'll be looking at phenomenology in particular the first video. So until then, next time we'll get straight into being and nothingness.